Very pleased and honored now to introduce MelissaOhden, our keynote speaker tonight. Melissa, as many of you probably know from some of the advanced publicity, is a survivor of a failed saline infusion abortion in 1977. Despite the initial concerns regarding Melissa's future after surviving the attempt to end her life and being born alive at approximately 7 months gestation, she has not only survived but thrived. With a master's degree in social work, she has worked in the fields of substance abuse, mental health, domestic violence, sexual assault counseling, child welfare, and Melissa was formerly a college outreach speaker with Feminists for Life and former patron of Real Choices Australia. She's the founder and director of For Olivia's Sake, an organization which seeks to raise awareness of the intergenerational impact of abortion on men, women, children, families, and communities. The birth of Olivia, her first child, in 2008, who never would have existed if Melissa's birth mother's abortion would have succeeded in ending her life, has prompted Melissa to create this organization that would positively raise awareness of the ripple effect of abortion across generations. In 2012, Melissa founded the Abortion Survivors Network. After recognizing the number of abortion survivors and how most felt alone in this role, and after recognizing the need for the public to be educated about the reality of failed abortions and abortion survivors. Since this group's inception, Melissa has been in contact with over 130 survivors, and she is working on a healing ministry curriculum and a retreat for survivors. Her life and ministry is featured in the award-winning pro-life documentary, A Voice for Life. After years of searching for her biological family and offering them forgiveness for the decision that was made to end her life, Melissa's story and her life is so much more than one of survival. Her life story is about the beauty of God's grace in our lives, about the power of love, about the hope for joy and healing in the midst of grief and loss, and about the transformational power and forgiveness in answering God's call in your life, fulfilling the purpose that she believes God set out for her when he saved her from the certain death of the abortion attempt. Melissa is truly a voice for the voiceless. Melissa comes, of course, to tell us more about her story tonight, but she speaks also on behalf of the Vitae Foundation and their work, to whom the proceeds of this evening's dinner will be donated. So I'm very happy to introduce MelissaOhden.
Well, after an introduction like that, is everybody ready to hear me speak? I know that sometimes people hear that and go, oh, this is going to be a long one. I think I'm in good company, though, tonight. We in this room know that God is in the business of writing miracle stories every single day. And I happen to be here tonight as one of those miracle stories by his grace alone. But it's also because of ordinary people just like you and me who over the years have been willing to stand up in defense of life and get involved. You're going to hear tonight, I have a pretty amazing life story. It has God's fingerprints all over it. What you're also going to hear tonight is about the important work that the Vitae Foundation is doing. I am blessed to not only be here tonight as someone who survived a failed abortion, but I'm here tonight as someone who sits on the board of the Vitae Foundation and gets to see the amazing life-saving work we are doing by partnering with people across the nation every single day. And so I get to share that a little bit with you tonight. But I'm also going to be sharing with you a lot about how other people's great stance when it came to life saved mine. You know, the word that's kept coming back to me tonight so far after being here in Colorado Springs just today and meeting many of you tonight, the word that keeps coming back to me is being humble. I have the great sense that so many of you in this room have been involved in the defense and protection of life long before I ever came along. And you are very humble about your efforts. And I thank you for that. And I hope that you recognize that your efforts do not go unnoticed. Someday in heaven, you will have the great opportunity to meet children like me who will say thank you. You will hear from their mothers and their fathers and their extended family who will also thank you for what you have done for them. And I say that because I have been able to do that in my own life. I was born and raised in Iowa. Anybody ever been to Iowa? Why do people laugh? I always wonder about that, right? You know, I was in Nashville last night shooting a television show, and typically when I tell people I'm from Iowa, they all laugh. And not in a funny, we support you kind of way, a funny, haha, you're from Iowa, I feel so sorry for you kind of way. And that's typically what that laughter is followed up with. People say, oh, I'm so sorry. Well, you don't have to feel sorry for me. That's where the Lord intended for my life to begin. And you don't have to feel sorry for me anymore because I now live in Kansas City. Are there any Royals fans in the room? Thank you. You know, I was in the Bay Area last week, and that was a difficult conversation to have with baseball fans. So I can say that in this room. But, you know, I was speaking in Iowa a number of years ago, not far from where my biological mother's abortion took place there. And as I shared my story that night, there were just two men on opposite sides of the room, overcome with emotion, to the point that they both held their head in their hands. And I watched them that night. You know, I wanted to have the opportunity to sit down with them and talk to them and find out what it was in my life story that had touched them so deeply. The younger man of the two from one side of the room got up and left before I had the opportunity to approach him. But the older man of the two stuck around. And as the night went on, I was waiting for that opportunity to talk to him. But before I could do that, he ended up climbing on the stage to give the closing prayer that evening. And we had a much smaller group than this. We had about maybe 200 people. And so he climbed up on the stage, and that's when I realized that he was no ordinary man overcome with emotion. He was a priest there in that community. And he spoke words that night that changed my life forever. And maybe they'll change yours too. He pointed out to our small crowd and he said, "And who says that prayers go unanswered?" And I was sitting in my seat thinking, my goodness, it really feels like he's talking to me. It's because he was. He went on that evening and he said, "I used to pray outside of St. Luke's Hospital in Sioux City, Iowa, back in 1977, that someday a child's life would be spared from an abortion. And here she is. I survived my biological mother's abortion in August of 1977 at St. Luke's Hospital in Sioux City, Iowa. And who says that prayers go unanswered?" And I had the great opportunity then, some years later, to tell the story about meeting that priest. And again, I was outside of the community where my birth mother's abortion had taken place. I was speaking at a fundraiser for a new pregnancy center we had started. We named it Mary's Choice and planted it right next to Planned Parenthood. Absolutely. And it's been amazing. It's been amazing to see the outreach of that center. It's been amazing to see Planned Parenthood build the walls and put the wire up and attempt to keep them out. But as I shared my story, as we raised funds for that new center, and I told them about meeting that priest, one by one, people stood up from their tables that night. Ordinary people, just like you and me. stood up from their tables, raised their hands, and said, "Melissa, I used to pray outside of that same hospital back in 1977. To the point that over 20 people were standing that night, face to face with someone whose life was spared because of their prayers. And so I share that with you as a further encouragement. And on behalf of children who will never have the opportunity to say thank you, I thank you for all that you've done and all you will continue to do in defense of life. And now you all know a little bit about how I came into this world. Has everybody done the math to know exactly how old I am? I don't think I said it out loud. You know, sometimes that's the one thing people get focused on in my story. I'm fascinated by that. I'm 38, and it's okay. You know, I made the mistake once. I was speaking to a group of young men, and I'm never going to say what state it was. It wasn't Colorado. But I was speaking to a youth group of young men, and I said, "Hey guys, I survived an abortion back in 1977. Do the math. How old am I?" Dangerous question, right? 88. And that was a few years ago. So either I was having a really rough day. So that's why I kind of get that out of the way. Let's all do the math together. I'm 38. It's okay. And in reality, my survival will always be brought up by me because no one but God could have spared my life back in 1977. And what I know about my biological mother is that she fits most statistics when it comes to abortion. My biological mother was 19 years old. She was a college student. She wasn't married to my biological father. And sadly, she fits a statistic that many people in our world aren't aware of. You know, almost 64% of women in our world today report being coerced into having their abortion. So it isn't their choice. Someone else makes that choice for them or puts them in that position that abortion is the only option made available to them. You know, the work that we do at Vitae is that we use research and cutting-edge media to not only educate the public about the sanctity of life, but to inform women about the choices that exist to them in their community. You know, most people know where to go to have an abortion. What they don't know is where they can go to get support and have access to resources. And so that's what the work of Vitae is, using research to know what drives that abortion decision, the dynamics behind it, and reach out to women in need. My biological mother was one of those women in need. I spent years of my life believing she was coerced into having that abortion at the age of 19. But what I know now is that it was actually taken one step further for her. She was literally forced against her will to have a saline infusion abortion. And I'm sure many of you remember the saline infusion from back in the 1970s. It was the most common procedure back then. That saline infusion abortion involved injecting a toxic salt solution into the amniotic fluid surrounding me in the womb. The intent of that toxic salt solution was to scald me to death from the outside in. If you look it up on the internet, you can read about how children like me are actually called the red-skinned or candy-appled babies because that toxic salt solution would turn the skin bright red as it peeled it away and moved internally into the organs. You can read about how the procedure was usually completed within about 72 hours. That toxic salt solution was delivered. The child soaked in it until their life was effectively snuffed out. And then premature labor was induced with the intent of a deceased child being delivered. What I know in my own life is that I actually didn't soak in that toxic salt solution for just 3 days. My medical records indicate that I soaked in it for 5. 2 days longer than what I was even intended to by those standards for the procedure. And nobody can tell me why it was, except that they absolutely intended for my life to be ended through that abortion. Some of you may be questioning already who it was that forced my biological mother to have that abortion. You know, the first guess is usually that it was my biological father. Makes the most sense, doesn't it? When we know the important role that men play when it comes to life being protected and respected, or ultimately rejected. But it wasn't my biological father. It was my grandmother, my birth mother's mother, who was a prominent nurse there in the Sioux City community, who had to have known a lot of scientific information about when life begins, but also knew how to make something like a secret forced abortion take place. And we live in a world that expects for me to hate my grandmother for what she did to my birth mother and I. I'm here to tell you, I don't hate her. I love her. I love her in that radical way that Jesus loves each and every one of us, that way that some people in our world can't even begin to wrap their head or their heart around. And I can't imagine what drove her to that point in her life. I can't imagine what her life was like after that day, making those decisions about my birth mother's life and mine. But here she forced that abortion upon her own daughter. And as horrific as it is for me to think about what it must have been like to fight for my life in the womb over those 5 days, I can honestly tell you it's just as horrific for me to think about what it was like for my biological mother. You see, she actually hid her pregnancy for over 5 months in an attempt to protect me. She knew her family well enough to know that when they found out she was pregnant, she knew what they were likely going to do. And so she hid her pregnancy, trying to save me. That's why I do what I do. Some of you may think I look familiar. You know, as the bishop has kind of mentioned, I've been making the rounds, and I was recently testifying before Congress. 3 to 4 million YouTube hits later on that testimony, a lot of people recognize me. And a lot of people recognize me and say, she's against abortion. That is true. But what they don't talk about is what I am for. And I am for women. I am for men. I am for children. I am for families. I am for a culture of life being restored in our country, in our world. And I hope that you are there with me. Can you imagine what it was like for my biological mother over those 5 days? To know that she didn't want to have that abortion. To know that she probably felt me fighting for my life in the womb, because I have met far too many women just like her who underwent the same procedure and did feel their children fight for their lives before they ultimately lost them. That's why we fight for a culture of life in our world. And after we were subjected to that toxic salt solution for 5 days, my birth mother's premature labor was induced. August 29th of 1977. Anybody know offhand the significance of that day? Right? The beheading of St. John the Baptist. What a coincidence, right? The day that I survive. But I was delivered there at St. Luke's Hospital. And from what I can gather, it didn't take them long to realize that the abortion failed to end my life. And as you're going to hear about tonight, it's really taken years of my life to piece together the events that happened that day. But one of the first things I was told is that after I was delivered there at St. Luke's Hospital, the abortionist looked upon my live birth and demanded that I be left to die. It's a sad thing about our world today, isn't it? It's a sad thing to know that I am not the first child that this has happened to. It's even more sad to realize that I am not the last child that that has happened to. And even more sad for me is the real truth of what happened that day. I now know that it actually wasn't the abortionist who delivered me in that final step of the abortion procedure. I now know it wasn't the abortionist who looked upon my live birth and demanded that I be left to die. Maybe you've already figured out who it was, based on what I've told you. It was my grandmother, the nurse, once again, who delivered her firstborn grandchild in that forced abortion and still demanded that she be left to die. And again, I don't fault her for that. I truly believe that this is what abortion has done to our culture. There are people just like my grandmother making an important decision about life every single day, whether they are right there in that hospital or clinic room. And I can only imagine what her life was like after that day. And I know what happened to children like me at that hospital. Some of you may have heard it in my testimony before Congress. You know what happened to children like me there at St. Luke's Hospital who survived abortions? We were placed in the utility closet in a bucket of formaldehyde to be left to die. And I know that because I've met a nurse who did that very thing to a little boy who survived an abortion in 1976. And my parents had heard the whisperings over the years. So a bucket of formaldehyde in a utility closet was meant to be my fate that day, even after I survived that failed abortion. But no matter what decision my grandmother was trying to make about my life that day, there were somehow 2 nurses on staff who found out about that secret abortion and the little girl who had survived. And those nurses fought for medical care to be provided to me that ultimately sustained my life. I am so thankful for those 2 nurses. And I know that you, and not even me, will likely ever be in the position that they were in. But I truly believe that all of us are making a similar difference every day in lives like mine, by our actions or our inactions, our words or lack of words. We are having a powerful impact on someone's life. And I think you could probably join with me in recognizing that those nurses had a huge impact on my life. Because you would never know by looking at me tonight, right? That I should have been scalded to death in the womb. You would never know that when I first survived the abortion, I was still fighting for my life. I weighed a little less than 3 pounds. I was 2 pounds, 14 ounces when I survived that failed abortion, which reflected to the medical professionals my birth mother was further along in her pregnancy than what they had guessed. And one of the first notations by a doctor in my medical records is that I looked like I was about 31 weeks gestational age when I survived. But I was a little less than 3 pounds. I suffered from severe respiratory and liver problems. I suffered from seizures for an extended period of time. I required multiple blood transfusions. If you see pictures of me on the internet or on various television shows, you'll see my head was shaved from temple to temple because I was fed through IV lines in my head for a period of time. And the doctors made a couple things about my life very clear from early on. First of all, in case you're wondering, there is no medical reason why anybody like me exists in the world. I'm sure we have a group of doctors who could confirm that tonight. There is no medical reason why I'm here tonight. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. I hope you are too. I know who the greatest physician in my life truly is. But the other thing they made clear about my life is that they didn't believe I was going to continue to live for very long. And if I did live, I was going to suffer from multiple disabilities, ranging from blindness and deafness to having emotional and mental disabilities. Which begs the question that you're all thinking, is there something wrong with her that we didn't see when she took the stage, right? It's okay. We can all laugh nervously about it. Trust me, I get it a lot. You can probably guess by the way I handle the situation. No matter what the doctor said about what my life was going to look like, I'm standing here tonight perfectly healthy. Thanks be to God. It's pretty amazing stuff, but I don't take my gift of health or a strong voice for granted. It was not for my benefit. It's truly for God's purpose in my life, to be a voice for tens of millions of children who are never going to have the opportunity to speak a word. But here I survived that failed abortion, defying all the odds that the doctors had for me. And we live in a world, though, that hears those kind of things, right? And still wants to say, ooh, maybe that's a life not worth saving. Maybe that baby is not a life worth loving. But I will tell you, my parents, my adoptive parents, didn't hesitate for a second to open their hearts and their home to me when they received that call from social services about the little girl who had survived an abortion and was fighting for her life. You'll catch my parents sometimes on various interviews, and they talk about how the first time they met me, I was still lying in an incubator, full of tubes and wires, fighting for my life. And my mom and dad always say the first time they laid eyes on me, they fell in love with me. That's what we want for every parent in our world, don't we? We want every parent to have the great opportunity to fall in love with their child the way my parents fell in love with me. And that's also part of the work that Vitae is doing by partnering with pregnancy centers, by giving women that information on where they can go. Just think of how many women and men have the great opportunity to fall in love with their children. And my parents' love transformed my life. I hope that you believe along with me that love transforms people's lives. If you've ever wondered what you can do to make a difference, I always like to say you can start with simply loving the people who come into your life. Because my parents' love changed my life. The love of the doctors and nurses who cared for me, some of them I've actually met personally. I know how those nurses in the NICU gave me a name when I was left nameless for months. How they knitted me clothing that I still have in my possession today. How they fed me from a bottle even when the doctors told them not to do it. Because they loved me and they believed in me. And because of that great love, I was healed enough to go home to my family less than 3 months after I survived that abortion. And I grew up in a home where adoption was the normal fabric of our family. My older sister is adopted from another family. And then my parents adopted me no matter what they were told my life was going to look like. And then lo and behold, after 15 years of infertility, along came my little brother. And as you can gather, he's not adopted. And we were stunned. I don't think mom and dad so much. They probably were prayerfully considering that that would happen in their lives. But my sister and I were absolutely stunned that they were having a biological child. Because what we were actually expecting was for them to say, we're adopting again. You know, that made sense in our world. Because even at the age of 7, I was thinking, why would you have a biological child when you could just do this again? I mean, look at how good it's turned out for you. And my parents knew that those thoughts went through our heads. And you'll catch my brother sometimes in documentaries and things like that, telling some interesting stories about me. They may or may not be true. They're true. And I think I can probably safely say the joke that we used to say to him growing up to you. I think I can say this to you tonight. We used to say to my brother growing up, you know, they had you. They chose us. And I know that that is not a safe joke in certain circles, but I feel like I can trust you with that. And I share that because that's how loved we felt in our family. When I talk about what I'm for in this world, I'm also for adoption to be considered as an option in the face of an unexpected pregnancy. You know, I'm sure many of you have heard what I have over the years. I've had women turn to me and say, Melissa, I will abort my baby before I would ever give them up through adoption. And as much as it hurts to hear that, it's a huge educational piece. Because words are very important. And I always encourage people to use words like placed for adoption. An adoption plan was made. I wasn't given up. I was placed for adoption. Words are powerful. And I'm the first person to admit that adoption is not easy. It's not easy to be an adoptee every day. It's not easy to be an adoptive parent. It's not easy to be a biological parent every day. But no matter what, adoption is the option that everyone can live with. Everyone can live with adoption as an option in their life, most importantly, that child. And that's what I knew growing up. I knew that my birth parents loved me enough to give me the gift of life and the gift of a family when they couldn't care for me. What I obviously didn't know was the story behind my adoption. I was 14 years old when I found out about surviving that failed abortion. And I know most people hear that and shake their head and say, oh, why would anybody tell you at the age of 14? I wasn't supposed to find out at the age of 14. I wasn't supposed to find out ever. My parents were going to keep it a secret because they knew it had the potential to devastate me. But when I was 14, a very unplanned, unexpected thing happened at our house. My older sister faced her own unplanned pregnancy as a high school student. And even though we were raised in a home to know about the dignity of life from the moment of conception, even though we knew what a gift adoption was, my sister was strongly contemplating having an abortion. I am so thankful that no matter how scared she was 24 years ago, she ultimately told our parents that she was pregnant. And my parents felt called to tell her the truth about my survival, hoping that she would understand the depths of the decision she was considering. I don't take for granted that she had someone to turn to, and I hope that you don't either. Most people in our world today don't have a supportive friend or family member to turn to in their time of need, who is going to speak the truth in love to them. That's again where all of us come in, being willing to support them where they're at, speak the truth in love to them about abortion and its consequences, point them in the direction of the pregnancy center. You know, that's the work of Vitae right there, is partnering with centers and other organizations to create a culture of life so someone always has a person to turn to. And it made all the difference in her world. It was about 24 years ago that she found out about my survival. My oldest nephew is about 23 years old. He's a member of the military. He's a father. He's an amazing man. And he knows that his very existence was made for such a time as that. Because when my sister found out about my survival, like any good sister, she didn't keep it a secret from me. I gather some of you have sisters. You know, she didn't tell me everything, but she kept encouraging me to ask our parents for more to the story of my life. And lots of people ask me now in hindsight, you know, Melissa, didn't you ever see this coming? You know, didn't you ever feel different? Nope. I can honestly say no, emphatically no. I never felt this different. At the age of 14, I didn't know that abortions could fail. I didn't know that people like me existed in the world. I now work with survivors, and I know of 206 other people like me. But back then, I had no idea. And so I didn't see it coming on an October night, much like this one. I sat our mother down and asked her to explain to me why it was my sister was saying all of those things. And in the midst of her conversation, she kept saying, you know, Melissa, honey, we love you. We'll always love you. And then the words just fell out. She said, Melissa, your biological mother had an abortion during her pregnancy with you, and you survived it. And there are no words. 24 years later, I can't even begin to tell you what that night was like, except utter devastation. I was angry that night. I was angry with my biological parents for the first time in my life because I couldn't understand how anybody could make that kind of decision about my life. I was ashamed to have survived an abortion. I was embarrassed. I felt guilty for surviving when we know tens of millions of children have not been as blessed as I am. And as angry as I was that night, as tumultuous as those feelings were, you know, the Holy Spirit moved in such a powerful way in my life very quickly to remind me that I have nothing to be angry about. You know, I am one of a handful of survivors out of nearly 57 million lives lost in our country since abortion was legalized. I have nothing to be angry about. I was given the amazing gift of my family who has supported me every step of this journey. I have nothing to be angry about. I knew, even at the age of 14, God had a particular calling for my life, even though it took me years to fully accept and embrace it. I have nothing to be angry about. But what I started to feel all those years ago was just immense grief. And not just for the children like me that lose their lives to abortion every day, But I felt incredible grief for my biological parents and the men and women like them that are facing an abortion decision. I didn't know back then that my biological mother was forced into that abortion. But what I knew is that her life had to have been forever changed after that day. And God set me out on a journey to find my biological parents, to let them know that I love them and I have forgiven them. And I know that people hear me talk about forgiveness and sometimes start to shudder a little bit. You know, we know that we are forgiven. We know that Christ died for our sins. But I think it's easy to struggle with forgiveness. And recently, my pastor had the most beautiful homily. And he reminded us that it's really outside of human capacity to forgive. What we have to do is pray for the grace to forgive. And I have prayed that prayer for so many years. And it's easy for me. It becomes easy for me when I realize that Christ died for that abortionist and my grandmother and my biological parents as much as he died for you and for me. But as I shared on a television show last night, to me, forgiveness is not something that you just do once and walk away from. Forgiveness is an attitude. It's a way of living your life that you continue to walk out time and time again. Because even though I first forgave my biological parents years ago, things happen in my life where I have to choose to forgive once again. You know, I'm the mother of 2 little girls, a 7-year-old and a 1-year-old. And I have to look at my children every single day and know that they never would have lived if that abortion would have succeeded in ending my life. It's a pretty painful thing to recognize. And instead of being angry when I realize that, I choose to forgive over and over again in my life. And I hope that you can choose to walk that out in your life also, because it has changed my life. You know, I started looking for my biological parents when I was 19 to offer them that message. I didn't find them until I was almost 30. Anybody ever walked in the wilderness in their own life? Biblical proportions, right? You know, I tried everything in those 10 years to find my biological parents. I tried everything to obtain my medical records because even though I felt unprepared to come forward with this story, I always knew God was calling me forward with it. And I knew that if I came forward, people would want to dismiss my story. And so I knew those medical records were incredibly important. You know, during those 10 years, I truly learned about trusting in God's will, of understanding his perfect timing in the face of my utter impatience. During those 10 years, of course, I was also very blessed. I married my husband. Lots of people have questions about him. He does exist. He just doesn't get to travel with me very often. He's an IT guy, so he is on his computer all the time. But my husband, God bless him, is the most supportive person in my life. And I was sharing with somebody earlier, when I prepared to testify before Congress recently, I was pretty nervous. You would never know by the testimony that I gave. But I was nervous in preparation, and my husband, being the amazing man he is, said, "Melissa, when you go out there, just remember you know more than all of them do." I love that man. I love that man. During those 10 years, I ended up moving to the Sioux City community, you know, that very same place where my birth mother's abortion had taken place. I never thought for a second that it would be part of God's story of redemption and reconciliation. I simply moved there to finish my master's degree in social work. But because God has a funny sense of humor, during those 10 years, I actually started working for the same adoption agency that handled my own adoption. Does anybody else ever find themselves doing things on a daily basis and wonder how they got there? You know, I do that a lot. And I know that it is Christ alone that has gotten me to that position. But I'll admit, after searching for my biological parents for 10 years, there are days where I sat in my office and wanted to peek in a file. I'll admit that. Am I the only one that would have thought that? I hope not. After 10 years of searching, I was ready to find them. I was ready to come forward with God's story. But I never peeked in a file because I once again trusted that if God intended for me to find my biological parents, it was going to happen in His way and in His time. And lo and behold, in 2007, God's perfect timing came to fruition. I tried one final time to obtain my medical records after being told over the years, no, 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 there is nothing about you here. I tried one last time, and you can see copies of my medical records now on my website. It's just MelissaOhden, OHDEN.com. And on the photos page of my website, you can see what I received back in 2007. It says things like, a saline infusion for an abortion was done, but was unsuccessful. What a powerful statement that is, right? I loved showing that to Congress recently, because you can't hide behind rhetoric. You can't hide behind words anymore when you read statements like that. I'm only here tonight because an abortion didn't succeed in ending my life. And as hard as it was to read some of those things, I ultimately had great joy. Because even though I spent years thinking I might peek in a file to find my biological parents and commit a pretty big HIPAA violation, right? When they sent me my medical records, they committed an even greater HIPAA violation. They forgot to black out my birth parents' names. We could call that a HIPAA violation. I choose to call that divine intervention. I don't know about you. I'm sure you were all wondering why I told you that piece about peeking in a file, right? Because God's plans are sometimes so wild, right? I never could have imagined that I would receive their names by receiving my medical records. And that very same night, I started searching for my biological parents, and you're never going to guess what I uncovered. I was living right there in the very same community as my biological father. 30 years after the abortion, there he was. God had a clear plan of reconciliation. And after months of praying about it, I ultimately sent him a letter. I sent it to his office, hoping to protect him a little bit, not knowing if he had ever told his family. And I told him all the things I've told you all tonight. I know the truth. He's loved. He's forgiven. And I closed the letter by letting him know we were in the same city and I would be waiting to hear from him. That was 2007. And I'm still waiting. And that is okay. Think about all the years that I was given to prepare for that possibility. And in reality, it's much more complicated, as you're going to hear about in a second. Because abortion complicates people's lives, doesn't it? That's one of my great frustrations with the abortion industry, is that far too long, women have been told that abortion simplifies things. You can have an abortion and move on with your life. Life is better after an abortion. I can count on one hand how many women have ever told me anything like that. What I can't even begin to count are the number of women and men who have told me that their life was forever changed after an abortion. And so I never heard back from my biological father, and you're going to hear about why that is in a second. But about that same time, I turned my sights on my birth mother. I actually couldn't find her through my searching because she married someone else after the abortion took place. Because so many relationships end after an abortion. And my biological parents were one of those relationships. And so she married someone else, and I couldn't find her. But I found her parents. That grandmother that I told you all about? I didn't know back then about the heavy role my grandmother played in everything taking place. I would like to think, though, if I would have known then what I know now, I still would have sent them that letter, because I was asking them to reach out to my birth mother on my behalf. Never expected to hear back from them, but within just about 3 short days, my grandfather replied. The very first thing he said in his letter was that he knew, I knew, my live birth was not the intention that day at the hospital. I think that was incredibly courageous of him, considering the circumstances. And it was equally courageous for him to go on and tell me some things about my biological family. What he was actually doing was telling me about how abortion had changed our family for generations. I don't think he recognized that. And I'm sure many of you see this in what you work with every day too. The first thing he shared was that my birth mother had never told anyone about her abortion. No woman deserves, and no man deserves to suffer with the pain of abortion. You know, I am so thankful for ministries like Rachel's Vineyard and Project Rachel, for the incredible healing that they bring in people's lives. I want that for every woman. I want that for my biological mother. I want that for entire families. But the other thing my grandfather said in closing was something that I didn't first understand. I understand it now, though, and maybe you will too. He ended his letter by letting me know my message of forgiveness would not be passed along to my birth mother because they were estranged. And it makes sense, doesn't it? When we know what happened 38 years ago, it makes incredible sense that their relationships have been severed. And I share that because if you haven't seen it yet, abortion doesn't just end a life and change a life. It changes entire families for generations to come. It has ultimately changed the landscape of our society. And I truly believe that for us to move forward in our country, it's going to be about finding healing for everyone who's been impacted by an abortion. But that was the last time I heard from my grandparents, was back in 2007. That's also the very first time I came forward publicly as a survivor, because God put into motion a chain of events very quickly that I couldn't turn away from. The very first time I spoke publicly was on Capitol Hill out in Washington, D.C. Not a bad first speaking engagement straight out of the gate, right? I can tell you they were a much friendlier crowd back then. That was friendly fire. It wasn't quite so friendly at the beginning of September this year, but I like how God gave me many chances to prepare for this most recent time of testifying. But that first time I was out there, I was thinking, oh, you know what, thank you, Lord, for this opportunity, but I'm never going to do this again. Anybody else ever done that? You know, I often joke to our priest, I sometimes feel like I am engaging in public confession on a regular basis. I'm admitting so many things. You know, I was turning to God and saying, thank you, but no thank you. I don't really want to be a part of this. I'm not a public speaker. Yes, I am. Yes, I am. And I share that with you because I think sometimes, you know, we read the quote, right, where we say, God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called. But my question for you is whether you actually believe that about yourself. I hope that you do, because trust me, I was not equipped for this. I didn't think so. God simply called me, and I suddenly found I was equipped to fulfill his purpose in this world. But that first time I was thinking, I'm not gonna do this again. And I went home and I told my husband about my terrible case of nerves. It didn't take us very long to actually realize that what I had wasn't a bad case of nerves. I had a really bad case of morning sickness with our oldest daughter. You all laugh. It wasn't very funny at the time. She laughs about it, though. She thinks it's great. I was just a few days pregnant with Olivia the first time I ever spoke publicly, and I know that is not a coincidence. Nothing ever is. But it was during my pregnancy with her that I got more involved in pro-life ministry. I am the first person to admit that over the years, I have had to learn to give up my career, to give up my comfort, to accept God's calling, no matter what that sacrifice is. And that's the time in my life where I started to loosen my grip. I started to travel around the world and advocate for people to choose life. What I didn't know, though, is that as I was starting to advocate for life, my birth father was back home in Iowa fighting for his. And that's why he never responded to my letter, because he passed away about 6 months after I sent it, almost to the very day of the Roe versus Wade anniversary decision. And that is not a coincidence either. But I didn't know about it for months. I very innocently Googled his name one night on the internet and opened a hit from the local newspaper, so excited to read about his life. But of course, what I read about was his passing. And I'll admit that I questioned God that night. I questioned how that could be the plan. After searching for him for so long, I had found him. And then he was gone. But God communicated very clearly to me that I needed to be patient. that I needed to trust in his plan once again. And as the months unfolded after that, I got to see what the plan was. I didn't realize that when my birth father passed away, his family went to clean out his office, and they found my letter. He had received it, read it, and kept it tucked in his top desk drawer. Just as my birth mother had never told anyone about that abortion, neither had he. And you can imagine what a heavy blow this was to them, to lose him at the age of 51, and then to find out the secret about an abortion and a child who lived. Their grief was heavy. But they came looking for me. They were gracious enough to wait until after Olivia was born. They were following me on the internet to know that I was pregnant. And if you've questioned for a moment God's redemption in our world, Olivia just so happened to be born in April of 2008 at St. Luke's Hospital in Sioux City, Iowa. And if anybody wants to hear the story behind that, I would love to tell you personally later. It's a good story. And I will admit, it was not my plan. It was not my plan. Once again, it was all part of God's plan of redemption and reconciliation. But not long after she was born there, my grandfather and my great aunt from my birth father's family came into my life. And I have been so blessed to now have them as a part of my family. You know, I wish I could stand here tonight and tell you that my entire biological family has been able to bring me into their lives, but it's just not that simple. We can't undo what was done to my biological mother, my biological father, and me. And so I haven't yet met my grandmother. I haven't met my half-sister or my cousins or my aunts and uncles. We lived in the very same city for many years, but they couldn't bring themselves to meet me because there is guilt and there is shame and there is anger. And as hard as it is to see them walk through that, I trust that God will continue to heal them, just as he has healed me. And I also take incredible hope in now seeing what is happening in my biological mother's family. I haven't heard from my grandparents for many, many years, but it was back in 2013 that a member of her family, a cousin, reached out to me. Her cousin is the one who told me about the role my grandmother played in that forced abortion and my delivery. That cousin put me in touch with my two half-sisters. We haven't met yet, but we communicate quite frequently. And that cousin even opened the line of communication with my birth mother. And as you can guess, those were some really difficult conversations to have, even by email. And the reason why they were so difficult is because there was one final secret about my life that even my adoptive parents didn't know. The greatest secret is that my birth mother spent over 30 years of her life believing that I had died that day at the hospital. I'll let that sink in for a minute. It has taken me a couple of years now to wrap my head around that. My survival was kept a secret from her. And I can only make a few guesses as to why that was. But what I can tell you, unequivocally, is that she spent 30 years of her life being utterly devastated. She suffered physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. The first time she sent me an email directly, I was 37. It was my birthday. And she started her email by saying, 37 years ago today, I was robbed of you. And I can understand her sentiment. She went on and she said, my greatest regret in life is that I didn't run away from my parents to further protect you. No woman deserves to live with that kind of regret. And she initially couldn't believe that I love her. She resisted the fact that she is forgiven. And as hard as it was for me to walk through that with her, that was part of her own process of healing. And she now has come to accept the fact that she is loved and she is forgiven. And she has now started to tell people about me, even though she spent years of her life keeping that a secret and certainly not knowing the secret herself. And I am so thankful to be a small part of God's story of redemption and reconciliation in her life and in her family. But think for just a second with me, right? About how many tens of millions of women don't have that same opportunity. How many men and women know something quite different about the lives of their children? That's why I do what I do. That's why Vitae does the work that it does, to create a culture of life so that all life, men, women, children, families, ultimately communities, can live a life very different than the ones that my family has lived out. I am thankful for everything that all of you continue to do here in your community. And I want to close by just sharing a little bit about what Vitae is doing in your area. Vitae is headquartered in Jefferson City, Missouri. Anybody besides the board been to Jefferson City? You can laugh along with me, I know. I'll admit I didn't know where Jefferson City was until I moved to Kansas City. I'll admit that. You know, what I love about Vitae is that Vitae not only partners with organizations and pregnancy centers to create a culture of life and use media to inform people about life and get that support, but it's really cutting edge. We have had groundbreaking research over the years with the right brain people to uncover those emotional motivations that drive the abortion decision-making process. You know, that's incredibly important to know why abortion decisions are being made so that we can then provide the right information to steer women where they can go to get that support. The message is so important. But here in your area, it's called the Front Range, right? You can tell I'm from the Midwest. Here in the Front Range, Vitae is working with 4 centers on things like website construction, search engine optimization, and Facebook advertising efforts. If you want to know about what centers Vitae is working with, there's a great website. It's capital C, capital O, CARE, and there's a capital C on it. So capital C, capital O, capital CARE, 4women.org. And it's a great website where not only you can go, but we're hoping that women can go to find out where centers are locally for them to receive the support and the resources that they so desperately need. And if you go to that website, I hope that you find yourself as impressed as I was. You know, the language that is used on that website to guide women, to meet them where they're at and understand what they are going through. The wording is so powerful, and I have no doubt that that is going to be an important tool for all of the women and the men and the children here in your communities to get the message that they so desperately need. So I just want to thank you again for being here tonight. I want to thank you for offering your unique talents, your treasure, in the cause of life. I hope that you remember on the days that maybe get difficult in your own life that what you are doing absolutely makes a difference for generations to come. Thank you so much for being here tonight.